Hello everyone. This lecture is going to be covering the material from Chapter 1 in your Marab textbook, which is covering information on the human body. So this first chapter is kind of an introductory chapter, exposing you guys to some just general anatomical terminology, kind of explaining an overview of what really anatomy and physiology is going to be looking at, and giving you an idea of what's to come. So first we're going to kind of just go over what anatomy and physiology is, what it all includes, and a little bit of why it's important. Okay, so first of all, what is anatomy and what is physiology? So anatomy is the study of the structure of the body parts and their relationship to one another. Okay, so anatomy, you're just looking at the names of the different parts of your body, right? Whereas physiology, you're studying the function of the body parts. So trying to look at how they work to carry out all of their different functions, which is important because all of their functions is what allows us to live, right? So different tissues are going to work differently. They're going to do different things. We have nervous tissue that's going to carry information to our muscles, to our glands. Sensory information is going to be carried. Our muscles, right, are going to allow us to move. So physiology is looking at how that's happening. Okay. Another big part of this first chapter is some anatomical terminology, which can be pretty boring. Just some fancy words for things that you probably already have an idea of what they are, but now we're going to be learning the scientific anatomical terminology for it. And it's really important because when you get into higher level classes, or if you want to be a nurse or a doctor or a physical therapist, occupational therapist, whatever it is, these more scientific terminology, that's how colleagues in those health science fields are going to communicate. Okay, so if you're seeing a patient, you're not going to write patient has pain in their elbow, right, on their chart or something like that. We're going to be using more specific terminology. And it's important that we use this terminology because that way it's consistent between everyone in the field. Okay. When looking at anatomy, we can divide the anatomy into a few different categories. Okay. So again, anatomy is just looking at the structure. But if we're looking at the structures of large visible structures, that's considered gross or macroscopic anatomy. Okay, so it's things that we can see with our naked eye. So if we're learning the names of all the muscles or learning the names of the bones, obviously in the living human you can't see their bones unless you do an x-ray or something like that. But gross or macroscopic anatomy is studying the big picture items, what we can see, naming different parts of the brain, bones, regions of the skin, so on and so forth. Okay, so there's a few subdivisions. You have regional anatomy, which is all the structures in a particular area of the body. We can look at system anatomy, which is looking at just a single bodily system. So your cardiovascular system, your nervous system, your muscular system, right? And looking at all the structures within that system. And then we can also just look at just the surface anatomy of our body. So what you can see on a human just walking down the street. And trying to relate those internal structures to where they're at in the body in relation to the skin. Okay, so in this class, we're really going to be focusing on the second point here, which is system anatomy. So when we're going through the human body, we're not starting, in the arm and learning the arm muscles, arm bones, all the veins and arteries of your arm, your spinal nerves that go through your arm, right? We're not doing that. What we're doing is separating the anatomical features of the body by the system. Okay, so we're going to be looking at only the nervous system, learning all the nerves, the brain, nervous tissue, all of that stuff in one big chunk. Yeah. The next type of anatomy is microscopic anatomy, which the name kind of tells you what it is, but it's looking at small structures, so things that you can't see with the naked eye. Cytology is microscopic structure of cells, and histology is a microscopic study of the tissues. And we have a whole chapter on histology in the class, looking at different tissue types. So we're not going to look at this first one here, but definitely you'll be seeing histology a lot. Okay, and this is important when we talk about physiology, and I'll talk about that on the next slide a little bit. And then the last type of anatomy we could look at is developmental anatomy, which is the anatomical and physiological development throughout life, right? So looking at embryology, the development before birth, how adults, as you age, the body changes. We're not really going to be looking at that in this class. There are specific embryology classes, there's specific physiology of aging classes, because this whole section is like too much information for this basic class. Okay, so we're just going to be looking at anatomy and physiology, not really so much developmental. All right. Physiology, like I said before, is the study of the function of different parts of the body. Typically, we look at this in organ systems, right? So you're looking at the nervous system or the cardiovascular system and figuring out how the cells of that system function together to perform a specific task, okay? It's often going to focus on the cell and molecular level of the body, so that microscopic anatomy, because a lot of the ways these things function is happening on a very, very microscopic level, right? We have little chemical reactions that are allowing our nerves to transmit impulses, for our muscles to contract. If you look at the whole muscle, that's not really going to show you anything. You have to look at the cellular and molecular level of the muscle to really understand how muscles are contracting. So most of the physiology we'll be looking at in this class will be in the cellular and molecular level, okay? And a lot of students hate this part of the class specifically because to understand physiology, you need to understand basic physical principles, which I'm going to just say chemistry. So to understand how things are working, you need to understand what atoms are, what ions are, what different types of proteins, and all these different small cellular and molecular structures are really what's going to be focused on in physiology. So our next chapter, chapter 2, is going to be covering some basic chemistry concepts. Chemistry is a prerequisite for this class, so hopefully the next chapter is a bit of review for all of you, but if it's not, you might want to spend a little bit more time making sure you really understand the information about ions and concentrations, what different solutions are, things like that, because we're going to be using it throughout the rest of this class and also in your next class 208. Okay? And even though we look at anatomy and physiology as separate things, they really are inseparable. So this class, we're going to be kind of switching back and forth between anatomy and physiology. A lot of the lab is going to be focusing on and more so the anatomy, but what's really, they go hand in hand. To understand one, you should definitely understand the other. And it's kind of cool because the function always reflects the structure. So if you know the structure of the muscle, where it attaches to on the bones, it tells you right there what action the contraction of that muscle is going to produce, right? And this principle is known as the principle of complementarity of structure and function, right? So a really basic example is our teeth, right? The structure of them tells us what the function of them are. So our incisors, the teeth in the front here, this one, eating a carrot, incisors have really sharp edges, so they're really ideal for cutting food, right? Breaking off the piece of the carrot. And then in the back of your mouth, your molars are flat, which makes them better for grinding up food, okay? So you don't have just a whole bunch of molars in your mouth because you need to be able to bite food, chew through steak and stuff like that, and then the back grind stuff up and make it smaller so you can digest it. Okay, so that's just a very basic example of how your structure kind of tells you about the function of the body part, but you'll see that a lot through this class. All right, the human body is very organized, so we can go from the very smallest level, chemical level, to the whole organism level. Okay, so this is just very basic, but the first smallest level is going to be the chemical level. Okay, and in the next chapter, again, we're going to be talking about basic chemistry. But the smallest thing we have are atoms. Atoms come together to form molecules. Molecules are going to be different proteins, different carbohydrates, polysaccharides, nucleic acids, right? Those are going to come together and form the organelles, right? And you should know organelles are things such as the ribosomes, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum. Those organelles are going to make up our cells. Okay, so very small, we have the chemical level. This stuff we'll talk about in the next chapter. The chemical level makes up the cellular level. Our cells come together to make up the next level, which is the tissue level. And tissues are just groups of similar cells. Okay, after tissue level, we have organ level. So our organ, your heart's an organ, your lungs are organs. You have your pancreas, your spleen, right? All those different organs in your body. They're made up of 2 or more different types of tissues. So multiple tissues have to come together to make an organ. We have groups of organs called organ systems, and those are going to be organs that are working closely together. So your organ system, your cardiovascular system, your heart, all of your blood vessels are part of your cardiovascular system, right? Because they're all kind of performing a specific function to pump blood through your body, right? Your respiratory system, you have your lungs, your trachea, right? And again, the function of that system is to bring air into your body and carbon dioxide out of your body. So organ systems are groups of organs that all work together to do a similar function. And then the largest level we have is the organism, right? And that's you. You're an organism. You're made up of all these different organ systems that are doing different things, but come together to make you, the organism, okay? And we have a image here that's just showing that same thing. So it's showing your cardiovascular system. Again, the smallest level here, small, that looks terrible, but small is your atoms. They come together to make your molecules. Molecules come together to form organelles. Organelles all come together to form specific cells. And cells can look a lot of different ways. So this right here is a smooth muscle cell, which doesn't look like your typical cell that you might be used to in an introductory biology class. But in our body, we have some specialized cells that are going to perform different functions. Okay, and again, the structure of each individual cell tells you a lot about its function. Okay, so here we have the smooth muscle cell. A bunch of cells come together to make a tissue. So in this here, we have a smooth muscle tissue. The tissue is going to come together. A few different types of tissues are going to come together to make an organ. So in this case, we have a blood vessel, which, yes, that is considered an organ. So not just like your liver is an organ. Your blood vessels are organs too. And again, remember, you're going to have multiple types of tissues that make up each organ. So in your blood vessel, you have epithelial tissue lining it. You have smooth muscle tissue in the middle, and you're going to have some connective tissue around the outside. And again, all those tissues are going to come together to help that organ perform a specific function. Then you have your organ system, which are all of the organs that are going to come together to do the similar function. So for example, your cardiovascular system, you have your heart that pumps the blood, and your blood vessels, your veins and artery that deliver blood to and from the body. Okay? And you're going to have a bunch of different organ systems, and they come together to make you. You're the organism. Okay? And you're able to live, you're able to breathe, you're able to process food, do cool things, paint, draw, make music, whatever you like to do, you can do it because all of your organ systems come together and allow you to move, dance, whatever, okay? Okay. So all of this comes together to make you, which I just said like 500 times, but the reason we have these different organ systems is to help carry out these necessary life functions, right? So to live, you don't just have to be able to pump blood through your body, right? That's one part of it, but there's a lot of things your body needs in order to maintain life, okay? And these are called these necessary life functions. And I have a slide explaining all these coming up, but we have to be able to maintain boundaries, move, have some sort of responsiveness to external stimuli, be able to digest food, metabolism, excrete waste, reproduction, and also growth. Okay, so I'll go through each of those a little bit more. So the first one here, maintaining boundaries. Obviously, you're your own organism, right? Your own person. So there has to be some sort of separation between internal and external environments. So, for example, your skin separates you from your external environment, okay? But also within your body, you have individual cells, and those have to be separated from the other cells, right? You have individual cells. They are not just one big blob of tissue. You have boundaries within your body that are really important. So that's the first necessary life function. Movement, which is mostly performed by your muscular system. So we have skeletal muscles that allow us to move our body parts, so we can get around, we can, move. And then we also have some cardiac muscles and smooth muscles that move stuff through our body. Okay, so cardiac muscles are the muscles of our cardiovascular system, such as our heart and our blood vessels, so pumping blood through the body. And then smooth muscles are going to be what's allowing movement of food stuff through our digestive system, urine through our urinary system, and so on. We also have this term contractility, which is the movement of the cellular level. So inside of our cells, things aren't just sitting still, right? Things are moving within the cells as well, okay? Responsiveness, our ability to sense and respond to stimuli. Okay, so we have things like the withdrawal reflex, where if we have our hand over something hot, we can pull it away. We sense that it's hot and we respond by moving our hand out of the way to prevent injury. But also this responsiveness controls a lot of these automatic functions that we don't think of, such as breathing rate, our heart rate, digestion, different things like that, blood pressure. So our body senses different stimuli, responds, and can change these different things within our body. Okay, digestion obviously is important because we ingest food things, but we need to be able to absorb the simple molecules into our blood. Obviously, that's going to be important because that's going to what's going to give us the energy and the nutrients that our cells need to survive. Metabolism is just, very simply put, all of the chemical reactions that occur in our body cells. So we have different breakdowns of molecules, so taking a big protein from a steak, breaking it down into smaller amino acids that our body can use. And also anabolism, which is the synthesis of molecules, so our body's ability to make different proteins that are needed. So different enzymes, let's say, that are needed to break down food, our body has to make those too. So all these chemical reactions can be lumped under metabolism. Excretion is the removal of wastes from both metabolism and digestion. So obviously, the easiest thing to think about for excretion is after we eat, there's going to be unabsorbed foods that our body doesn't need, has to go somewhere, right? So we excrete that through our feces, your poop. You have urea excreted in your urine, carbon dioxide excreted in your breath, from your lungs, right? So we need to be able to get rid of stuff our body doesn't need. And then the last two here, reproduction and growth. Reproduction, what you would normally think, reproduction is production of offspring, right? So being able to reproduce, make more humans, but also within our body, at the cellular level, reproduction involves the divisions of cells for growth or repair. So one example that I think everyone's familiar with is that the skin covering your body on your epidermis, sheds off, right? And new skin grows, right? Your dead skin cells are constantly being replaced. That's considered reproduction. Okay, so your cells have to reproduce to create new cells to repair damaged skin, let's say. But also, when you're a little baby, obviously you're bigger now, so your ability to grow is a result of the reproductive nature of your cells. Okay? And then growth, which is kind of what I just talked about there, but increasing of size of a body part of an organism. So this is more when you're a baby. This is just division of cells for growth or repair. Increasing the size of a body part is growth here. So I'm sorry, I got that a little mixed up. But yeah, when you're a baby, you're small. You get bigger, so your ability to grow is another necessary life function. Okay? So this all should be review on this page. So we already talked about how humans are multicellular, right? Because you have individual cells that get together to make a tissue, right? And then your tissues get together to make organs. Those get together to make organ systems, right? All of those individual cells are what's going to be really important in your survival, okay? You have a lot of cells, so you might not need every single one, but you have some cells that are really, really important. So cells like your neurons or your muscle cells are going to be performing really specific actions. Neurons carrying information from your sensory receptors to your brain, or carrying information to your muscles, telling them to contract, right? So some cells are super important. Other cells in our body are there just to help support the other cells, right? So your organ systems are designed to service the cells, and the cells are going to be dependent on the organ systems to meet their survival needs. Okay, so our neurons, for example, again, they need nutrients, they need energy, right? They need different things in order to function properly. So our tissues and our organ systems are designed so that we can get the nutrients that our neurons need to where they need it. Okay, so everything is going to work together, obviously, for our body to work. And there are 11 different organ systems that we're going to be talking about. And a lot of these, hopefully, are a review because I think everyone has just a basic understanding of the human body. So if you don't know these, I'll spend a little bit more time reading through the book. I'm just going to quickly go through the ones you need to know. But as long as you can match the names of the system with their basic function and can kind of give me a general idea of what organs are in each system, you should be okay. So first we have the integumentary system, which is what forms our body covering. Okay, it does some other things too, but things like our hair, skin, and nails are part of the integumentary system. Our skeletal system protects our body and provides a framework for the muscles to connect to. So our skeletal system is made up of all of our bones and joints. Our muscular system, made up of muscles, it allows for manipulation of movement, locomotion, facial expressions, any movement, right? Nervous system is the control system of the body, right? Responding to different stimuli and responding. So our brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Our endocrine system are the glands that are going to secrete hormones, okay? They're going to regulate different autonomic processes in our body. So there's a lot of different endocrine glands, the pineal, pituitary, thymus, adrenal, pancreas, and then our reproductive ovary and testes. Our cardiovascular system, which we've already talked about, but it's transporting blood through the body. So our heart and our blood vessels. Lymphatic system is going to be the immune system of the body. So there's a lot of different organs again. Lymphatic vessels, our spleen, lymph nodes, thymus, red bone marrow. Respiratory system, breathing, gas exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we have our lungs, our trachea, nasal cavity, so on. And then the last few, digestive system, breaks down food for absorption, okay? So we have our esophagus, our liver, stomach, intestines, rectum, and anus. Your urinary system is eliminating nitrogenous wastes, okay? So your kidneys, ureter, urinary bladder, and urethra. And then the last system is your reproductive system, male and female, obviously different. Function is production of offspring. So for males, you have your penis, testes, scrotum, different glands like your prostate gland. Female, you have your uterus, your ovaries, uterine tubes, vagina, and some secondary sex organs like your breasts, mammary glands. Okay, and again, if some of this is unfamiliar to you, I would definitely recommend going through and reading your text. Okay, so in order to keep up with all these different life functions, humans need some certain things. So things such as nutrients, which I'm going to say are chemicals for energy and cell building. We'll talk about those more in the next chapter. Oxygen is essential for the release of energy from foods. Water is the most abundant chemical in the body. It's needed for a lot of chemical reactions. A normal body temperature, which is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. We need the normal body temperature so that we can do different chemical reactions in our body. And then the last one, which people don't normally think about, is the appropriate atmospheric pressure. And this is really important for breathing and gas exchange. Breathing and gas exchange, right? So in order to get the oxygen into our body and, sorry, my dog, and excrete the carbon dioxide, we need to be able to have appropriate atmospheric pressure. All right, and a big way we control all this is through homeostasis. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a stable internal condition. Okay, so obviously we're not always going to be in the same temperature room. We walk outside, it's colder, go inside, it's hotter, right? But our body's able to maintain these internal conditions that are pretty stable, and that process is called homeostasis. Okay, and it's always working. We're always readjusting our body temperature, our blood sugar levels, our respiratory rate, so on and so forth, to make sure that we're maintaining the perfect levels for our body. Okay, and all organ systems are going to contribute to this, some a little bit more than others, but they're all going to work together to make sure that our body is staying at the proper levels. Okay, and to do this, it must be constantly monitored and regulated. Okay, the big two organ systems that are going to be involved in this, which you need to know, are the nervous system and your endocrine system. Okay, again, I already said all of them kind of work together, but these two are the big daddies. Your nervous system and endocrine system are really going to play a major role in maintaining homeostasis. Okay, and the things that can change, so your body temperature, blood volume, blood sugar, all these things I just talked about, those are considered what we call variables. Okay, those are the things that homeostasis is going to keep in check. Okay, so homeostasis, you have three main components of it. You have a receptor or a sensor, a control center, and an effector. So starting at the receptor, your sensor is going to monitor your environment. Okay, so it's going to test your body and figure out if the levels are appropriate. So it's responding to some sort of stimuli. So say we're talking about body temperature, right? Your receptor is going to sense your body temperature. Okay, and if your body is too hot or too cold, it's going to send that information to the control center. Okay, your control center determines a set point at which the variable is maintained. So for example, your body temperature, like I talked about before, the set point for that is 37 degrees Celsius, right? So your receptor senses your body temperature, sends the information to your control center. And your control center not only determines the set point, but it's going to determine an appropriate response. So if it gets sent information that your body temperature is too low, it's going to determine what your body needs to do to raise that temperature back up. Okay? So your control center is going to determine a response and send that information to what we call an effector. The effector receives the information from the control center, and it is what's going to actually respond. So it's going to be what's responsible for, in this case, getting the body temperature back up to its appropriate set point. Okay? The response of the effector can be two different responses, two different categories. You can have negative feedback or a positive feedback mechanism. Okay, and I'll talk about those a little bit more in a second. Okay, so that's the basic layout. And there's two other things I want to add to this. So your receptor, like I said, it sends information to your control center. This is called your afferent or afferent pathway, your afferent pathway. Then your control center sending information to the effector is called your efferent. Okay, so receptor sends information through the afferent pathway to the control center. Your control center sends information through the efferent pathway to the effector. All right, and this is shown on the next page. Okay, so again, the first thing you have is your stimulus, right? So your body temperature change, for example. Your receptor is going to detect that change and send the information to the control center. Again, this is through the afferent pathway, what we just talked about. Your control center, again, is really important in determining the set point, so what the normal body temperature should be. If the control center determines that the body temperature is not at its set point, it's going to create some sort of response, and it's going to send that to the effector. Okay, and again, that's the efferent pathway. And the effector is what's actually going to do a response. Okay, the effector is going to change something in your body to get the, in this case, body temperature, that variable, back to its original set point. Okay. All right, so that's the basic breakdown. You have, again, some sort of stimulus, information sensed by a receptor. A receptor goes through the afferent pathway to the control center. Control center determines the set point and comes up with a response to the stimulus. Sends that information through the efferent pathway to your effector, and your effector makes some sort of change in your body. Okay? And again, this change by the effector can either be positive feedback or negative feedback, which we'll talk about right now. So negative feedback, again, the effector is producing this. Negative feedback is going to reduce or shut off your original stimulus. Okay, so the variable changes in the opposite direction of your initial change. Okay, so one big commonly used example for this is your regulation of body temperature. Okay, what we just talked about. So this image over here shows it. So let's start here at your stimulus heat. So if your body temperature gets too high, your body temperature rises, your receptor senses that change, sends the information to the control center through the afferent pathway. Control center determines what to do with that information. Our body temperature is too hot, we need to cool it off, right? So it sends cool off information through the efferent pathway to an effector, which in this case would be sweat glands. And the effector produces their response, which if our body temperature is too hot, we want to cool off, so we're going to sweat, like this guy over here, sweats, and then cools off the body and gets it back to normal. Okay, so we're moving in the opposite direction. Okay, opposite direction, negative feedback. our body temperature is hot, we want it cold. Okay. On the opposite, you can do the same thing. If our body temperature is too cold, again, the receptors are going to sense that, send that information to the control center. Control center is going to say, we need to warm up, send the information to the effector, which in this case would be our skeletal muscles. And the skeletal muscles are going to have the response, which is going to be shivering, right? And shivering is going to increase our body temperature, get it hot again. So negative feedback, again, it's always going to be moving in the opposite direction. So if you're too hot, you want to cool off. You're too cold, you want to warm up. Okay. Another example is the regulation of blood glucose. Okay, if our blood sugar is too high, we want to lower it. If our blood sugar is too low, we want to increase it. Okay, so that's negative feedback. The other type of feedback we have is positive feedback, which is going to enhance or exaggerate the original stimulus. Okay, most of the feedback we're going to see in their body is examples of negative. There's only a few instances where you'll see positive feedback. Okay, it says here it exhibits a cascade or amplifying effect. Okay, so it increases that original stimulus. So one example that I really like the best is during labor. We have oxytocin, we have contractions starting, right, when you're having a baby. Oxytocin is released, which causes contractions, which causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes more contractions, and it just keeps increasing that original stimulus, right? So that's positive feedback. Another one, platelet plug formation and blood clotting. We have a blood clot. We have platelets adhering and releasing chemicals to try to, we have a blood leak. Blood's leaking out. These platelets are going to release chemicals, right? Which is going to attract more platelets, which is going to release more chemicals, which is going to attract more platelets, which is going to release more chemicals, and more platelets and chemicals are going to come until you have a platelet plug and you're plugged up. Okay? So positive feedback, again, you're enhancing. You're going to continue on this cycle of increasing the stimulus, increasing until the end goal, which is a baby being born or a blood clot being formed, is achieved. Okay, which is opposite of negative feedback, which is going to reduce or shut off your original stimulus. Okay? Homeostasis is important, obviously, for maintaining our normal body function. If we have issues with our homeostasis, so our nervous system or endocrine system specifically can't maintain a balance in our body, we have an increased risk of disease. And this disturbance of homeostasis contributes to changes associated with aging. So these control systems or endocrine system becomes less efficient, so we can't respond as quickly. So our bodies get too hot and we can't cool them off as easy, or too cold, we can't warm up. So homeostasis is important. As we get older, our body doesn't do it as well. But if we get to a point where we can't do homeostasis at all, that leads to real problem disease, different things like heart failure, and death. So that's not good. All right, the second part of Chapter 1's lecture is covering anatomical terminology. So if you would like to take a break, now would be a good time to do it and come back and finish Chapter 1 later on. But anatomical terminology. So a lot of the information in the second half of the chapter you will be covering in lab. But I think it's important that you guys know this information, so I'm going to talk about it in lecture as well, hopefully just to reiterate some of these really important concepts. Okay, so to start, anatomical terminology, the very first thing you need to know is what's called the anatomical position. Okay, and anytime we're referencing the body, in human anatomy and physiology, or if you're a doctor or a nurse, physical therapist, whatever, anytime you talk about the body, you're going to be referring to it in what we call anatomical position, which is the body erect, feet apart, palms forward, with thumbs pointing away from the body. Also, I'm going to add here, should be in here, your toes are facing forward as well. Okay, so I should have included a picture, but you're standing, feet slightly apart, your arms down. This is terrible. Your palms are forward, so your thumbs are facing in. And your toes are pointing forward. Okay, facing forward. That right there is anatomical position. Okay, which is really important because when we start using directional terms, when we're referencing, one part of the body is superior, which is above something else. Say your eyes are above, your eyes are superior to your mouth. Obviously, if you're standing on your head, that wouldn't be true anymore, right? Because you'd be upside down. Your eyes would be below your mouth. So it's really important we reference the body in this anatomical position to make sure that anytime we're using directional terms or describing the relationships of different parts of the body, we're talking about the body the same way. Okay? And another thing, when we're talking about right and left in the body, so if I say this patient's right side, when you're talking about right and left, say their right arm is hurting, you're always talking about the patient's right. Oh, that's left. Shoot. Put yourself in the patient's shoe. This would be the patient's left side. This would be the patient's right side. Okay? So, right and left, the right arm would be your patient's right arm. Left arm would be your patient's left arm. Does that make sense? So you're always referencing right and left in relationship to the patient's body. Okay? Okay, and then some directional terms are just, like I said, are going to be used to describe the body structure in relation to something else. So like I said, the eyes are superior above the mouth. Okay, and again, that's why anatomical position is so important, because when we're using these directional terms, if our body's not in this position, they won't mean the same thing to everybody. Okay, so some important directional terms, again, you'll get these in lab, but I just want to go through them. So the first one is superior, which means towards the head, above. So superior is the top of the body. The opposite of that is inferior, which is towards the bottom of the body. Okay, so for example, your head is superior to your hands. Your feet are inferior to your knees, right? See that? So again, directional terms, you're describing the relationship of two body parts in anatomical position. So that's superior, above, inferior, below. Anterior, also known as ventral, is towards the front of the body. Posterior, which is also known as dorsal, is towards the back of the body. Okay, so anterior, front, posterior, back. So for example, your nose is anterior to your shoulders, right, because your shoulders are back there. Anterior means to the front. Your occipital bone, the back of your head, is posterior to your frontal bone at the front of your head. Okay? So anterior front, posterior back. Next we have superficial, which means towards the body's surface. The opposite of that is deep, which means away from the body's surface, so it's more internal. So for example, superficial, I'll just use this one here. The skin is superficial to the skeletal muscles, right? The skin is above, closer to the surface than your skeletal muscles. Deep, your lungs are deep to the skin, right? Your lungs are more internal than your skin is. Okay, so that's superficial and deep. Next one, proximal, closer to the point of origin. Distal, further from the point of origin. So a lot of times we use these when we're talking about our appendages, so like our arms and our legs. So proximal, closer to the point of origin. The point of origin is going to be where it attaches at the body, your shoulder, right? So closer to the point of origin. So your elbow is proximal to your wrist, right? Because your elbow is closer to that point of origin than your wrist is. Distal is the opposite, further from the point of origin. So your fingers are distal to your wrist, right? Distal means further away. Closer you get to the point of origin means proximal. Okay? That one I think is the trickiest one for people to remember. Next we have these three. Medial is towards the midline. And I'm just going to zoom in quick. The midline is the line that goes right through the middle of your body. So from your nose, down your belly button, down the middle of your legs is medial. Lateral is the opposite. Lateral is away from the midline. Okay, so imagine we have our eyes there, person's nose, and their mouth, right? Your nose would be medial to your eyes, right? Because your nose is more towards the middle than your eyes are. Same thing. Well, let's do a different one. How about your shoulder is lateral to your breast, right? Your shoulder is more lateral than your breast. And then the last one here is intermediate, which means between a medial and a lateral structure. So if this is, say we have your shoulder, your armpit, so your humerus is intermediate because it's between your shoulder and your armpit, in the middle. Again, that's intermediate. Okay? So those are the directional terms. Again, you'll see those a lot in lab, but we will use those throughout the entire semester, so make sure you're familiar with those. We can divide the body into two major divisions, axial and appendicular. Axial is the head, neck, and trunk. Right, so you can't really see that. But the head, neck, and trunk is axial, which means appendicular is the arms and the legs. The appendages are appendicular. Axial is the trunk of the body, if you will. Okay. We also have regional terms, which are all of these terms that are describing different parts of the body. Again, in lab, you're going to focus more on this. I'm not going to really talk about this in lecture. You will see some of these in questions and such in lecture, so I'd recommend you go through these, make some flashcards or something maybe. But I'm not going to be too worried about them, honestly. So these regional terms are just fancy anatomical names for things you already probably know. So for example, your shoulder, that's called the acromial region. Your upper arm is the brachial region. Your forearm is the antebrachial region, right? So everything that you know a basic name for also has this fancy regional term anatomical name, okay? And the only reason they do this, they being, I don't know, anatomical people, is people in the health sciences. When we're talking about a part of the body, we want to be as specific as possible. We want to make sure when we say a certain part of the body that, if someone else is reading notes on a patient, let's say, if we say they have pain in their arm, that's not very specific, and that can mean a whole lot of different places in their arm, right? So if we have these more specific names that everybody uses, then it's going to be easier to communicate what we actually mean when we're writing notes in a chart or discussing a patient's pathology or whatever with someone else, okay? Another fun anatomical thing are body planes, which are surfaces that your body can be cut in. Okay, so I'll show you this in a second. It's easier when you see a picture. But you have three common planes: sagittal, frontal, and a transverse plane. Okay, so if you think of like an MRI where you cut the body into sections, if you do an MRI and you see the brain in a certain way, that's just cutting the brain in a certain plane. Okay, so if we're cutting a sagittal cut, it's a sagittal section. Okay, also the pictures help. So here's the definition. So sagittal plane divides the body into right and left. Okay, so sagittal divides it into right and left. If you have it right down the middle, right on the midline, then it's called a mid-sagittal or a median plane. Okay. Parasagittal is any cut that's not on the midline. Okay, so parasagittal and sagittal are kind of interchangeable. Mid-sagittal is right down the middle. A frontal or coronal plane divides the body in an anterior and posterior, a front and back. Right? Anterior is front, posterior is back. So a frontal divides into a front and back part. Transverse or a horizontal plane divides the body into superior and inferior, or a top and bottom. Okay? So I'd write down sagittal, right and left, frontal, anterior, posterior, transverse, superior, and inferior. So this is the images kind of showing those. Okay, so this first one, we're dividing the body into a left and a right section, right? So that one would be a sagittal. And in this case, it's right down the middle, so we could actually say mid-sagittal for this one, right? Dividing the body into a right and a left. The second one, we're dividing the body into an anterior, right, and a posterior, a front and a back. This is called a frontal or coronal. Same thing, they're interchangeable. And the last one, dividing the body into a superior and inferior, a top and a bottom, kind of parallel with the ground, right? This would be a transverse or horizontal. Okay, so sagittal, right and left, frontal, anterior, posterior, transverse, superior, and inferior. So make sure you can look at this picture and name all the different planes. Okay, the next just general anatomy that you're going to have to know are the different body cavities. Okay, there's two main body cavities, your dorsal body cavity and your ventral body cavity. Your dorsal body cavity is what's in yellow in the image, so this part in the back there. Your ventral body cavity is what's in red in the image, so all of this in there. Remember, ventral is the same thing as anterior, which means towards the front. Dorsal is the same thing as posterior, which means towards the back. So if you know these directional terms, dorsal and ventral, it tells you where in the body they're at. Okay, and we can divide these even further. Okay, so I'm going to show you the divisions here. So for our dorsal body cavity, again, at the back of our body, this yellow part, we can divide it into cranial up here and vertebral. The cranial cavity contains the brain. The vertebral cavity contains the spinal cord. Okay, so cranial contains the brain, and then this whole section is the vertebral, which is going to contain the spinal cord. Okay, collectively, those are both part of the dorsal body cavity. Our ventral body cavity has a few more divisions than our dorsal. It houses all of your internal organs, so your lungs, heart, all of your intestines, stomach, liver, yada, yada, yada. Okay, and we can divide this even further as well. So first, the first division is separated by the diaphragm, which in this image, the diaphragm would be right here. Okay, so above the diaphragm would be your thoracic body cavity, and below the diaphragm is your abdominal pelvic body cavity. Again, both are part of ventral on the front side. These can be divided even further. So your thoracic contains 2 pleural cavities that go around the lungs. You have your mediastinum in the middle that surrounds your esophagus, trachea, etc. And also contains your pericardial cavity, which is around your heart. Okay, so I'm going to go back and just show you really quick. I should have put that image on this page. So your thoracic, you have your pleural cavities on either side that contain your lungs. The mediastinum is all down the middle. Okay, and then pericardial is right where your heart is, which is technically part of your mediastinum. Okay, so all of those together are your thoracic. And then your abdominal pelvic can be divided into 2, which these ones are really easy. Your abdominal and your pelvic. Your abdominal contains stomach, intestine, spleen, liver. Your pelvic contains urinary bladder and your reproductive organs. So abdominal and pelvic make up abdominal pelvic together. Okay. And again, I kind of moved fast, but stomach, intestine, spleen, liver, and your abdominal, pelvic, bladder, reproductive organs, and your rectum. Okay. In your ventral body cavity, so I'm going to show you one more time. Ventral body cavity, remember, we're only talking about your thoracic and your abdominal pelvic. You have a specific type of membrane. Okay, these membranes are called the serosa or your serous membranes, and these are really important. It's a double-layered sac that covers all the surfaces within that cavity. So your organs are held in the cavities, but they're not just in there willy-nilly. They have these serous membranes covering all your organs to help protect them. Okay, and these serous membranes have specific names depending on which organ it's around and which layer of the membrane it is. Okay, so I'm going to tell you. First, we have 2 layers of the membrane, right? The layer that lines the wall of the body cavity is called your parietal. The layer that covers the organs, directly is touching your organs, is called the visceral. Okay, and I'll explain this a little bit more in a second. Okay, so there's 2 layers, and in between the layers, there's a fluid called the serous fluid. Okay, you have serous membranes, serous fluid in the middle of it. The second part of the name of the membrane is named based on where, what cavity that each is associated with. Okay, so depending on if it's around your heart, your lungs, wherever it may be, you have the second part of the name. So pericardium, think cardia, is around your heart. Pleura, remember, think your pleural cavities. That's going to be around your lungs. And your peritoneum, doesn't really tell you where it's at, but that's going to be all lining your abdominal pelvic cavity. It's around all of your digestive organs, bladder, reproductive organs, all of those. Okay, so anytime you're naming a serous membrane, it's going to have 2 parts. Which layer it is it parietal or visceral? And then where is it? By your heart, your lungs, or your abdominal pelvic cavity? Okay, and this kind of shows it here. This is a good way to visualize it. So again, remember, our serous membranes are double layered. So we like to think of it as like a balloon. And if you were to stick your hand into a balloon, there's going to be a balloon directly touching your hand, right? the balloon directly touching your hand is going to be called the visceral. And I think visceral, V for very close. The other layer of the membrane, this balloon, is the balloon that's not touching your hand, right? That's going to be called your parietal. The parietal is what's going to be lining the cavity, whereas your visceral is what's going to be touching your organ. So, visceral very close, parietal further away. So for this example, we have our heart, right? So now your heart's in the balloon. You have a piece of the balloon directly touching the heart, right? This is your visceral pericardium. Pericardium because it's around your heart. Visceral because it's very close. You also have a layer of the membrane on the outside. So this would be lining your pericardial cavity where your heart's found. That is called your parietal pericardium because it's further away. Okay? And again, remember in the middle, there's a fluid. That's going to have your serous fluid in the middle of those two membranes. Okay, so that's how you're going to name all of the serous membranes. 2 parts names. Is it touching the organ? Visceral for very close, parietal for further away. And they can either be your pericardium, your pleura is going to be around your lungs, and your peritoneum is going to be around your abdominal pelvic. Right? Okay. Then just a few more slides. We also have fancy anatomical ways to divide our abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so remember, abdominal pelvic cavity is below the diaphragm. So if you look at our abdominal pelvic cavity, there's a lot going on. So we have these different quadrants that medical professionals divide this cavity into to try to help describe where certain things are happening. So if there's some sort of obstruction in, let's say, this large intestine, the large intestine goes a lot of different places. So if we can say the obstruction in the large intestine is in the right upper quadrant, then it helps other medical personnel know exactly where something's happening, right? Or if a patient has pain right here, let's say, we can say they have pain in their lower left quadrant. Okay, so the quadrants, they're 4, quad 4. You have the right upper, again, your patient's right, left upper, and then right lower and left lower. And those are pretty easy. Okay, and similarly, we have abdominal pelvic regions. Okay, and regions, instead of having 4 like the quadrants, we now have 9, kind of a tic-tac-toe type of board here. And again, abdominal pelvic, so it's below the diaphragm. And it's just more specific way to divide the abdominal pelvic region. So this one we have 9. They're labeled on here, but you have your right hypochondriac, right lumbar, right iliac, left hypochondriac, left lumbar, left iliac. And there's a few different names. Either one, any of them are fine. They're interchangeable. And then down the middle, epigastric, umbilical, and your pubic region. Okay, so same thing. If a patient has a pain somewhere, you're trying to do an incision, having specific names for these regions makes it so that people can communicate more effectively. Okay, pretty easy. And that's it. So that concludes Chapter 1 from your Merib text. If you have any questions, please let me know.